October 1415. 6,000 exhausted English soldiers face more than 20,000 French knights. The secret to victory. Mud up to their knees. It seems impossible. A sick army, starving, on the run, against the elite of French cavalry. Gleaming armor, trained war horses, absolute confidence. The French had no doubt. This would be an execution, not a battle. But something awaited them on that muddy field. It wasn't fear, it wasn't surrender. It was a king who saw what no one else did, and an element of nature about to transform absolute strength into deadly weakness. This is the story of Agincourt, and how mud changed the course of history. Let's start at the beginning. England, September 1415. Henry V had a dream, to prove he was the rightful king of France. Not just of England, of France itself. His strategy? Invade Normandy, besiege the port city of Harfleur, and use it as a base for greater conquests. It seemed like a solid plan, until it wasn't. The siege of Harfleur took 5 weeks. 5 weeks of bombardments, attacks, losses. When the city finally fell, the English army was shattered. Not by epic battles, but by something far worse. Dysentery. The disease spread through the camps like wildfire through dry straw. Strong men fell within days. They vomited until they lost consciousness. They defecated blood until they could no longer stand. The army that had arrived with about 12,000 men now barely counted 6,000 fit to march. And Henry V had a problem. He was 150 miles from Calais, the only safe English port in France. Between him and safety? Hostile French territory, an army in recovery. And now, the French autumn, with its relentless rains that turned roads into rivers of mud. The decision was simple. Staying meant dying of disease or being surrounded. Marching meant risking everything in a desperate race to Calais. Henry chose to march, but he knew every step they took on French soil was a gamble, and the French were watching. On the other side, the French nobility couldn't believe their luck. A sick, weak English army on the run. It was the perfect opportunity to crush that arrogant king who dared claim the French crown. More than 20,000 men began to gather. Knights from the noblest houses of France. Constable Charles d'Albret, the Duke of Orléans, the Duke of Bourbon. Men covered in steel, mounted on war horses that cost fortunes. Each suit of armor was a work of art, weighing more than 65 pounds. Each knight, a symbol of power and invincibility. To the French, this wasn't a war. It was a hunt. The English marched along the Somme River, trying to find a place to cross. But the French had destroyed the bridges. Every crossing point was blocked or guarded. Henry had to detour inland, losing precious days, spending energy his men didn't have. Finally, they managed to cross. But now the French knew exactly where they were, and they were closing in. On October 24th, the English saw the French army for the first time. Thousands of knights, banners fluttering in the wind, the sound of armor, the sound of horses. It was a terrifying sight. The English soldiers looked at their own ranks. Skeletal men, torn clothes, faces marked by disease. Many could barely hold their bows. Then they looked at the French again. How do you fight that? But Henry V didn't panic. He knew he couldn't win in a traditional battle. Heavy French cavalry against sick archers? There was no chance. So he did something unexpected. He chose the terrain. He chose where he would fight, and he chose a place that would change everything. Near the village of Agincourt, between the forests of Tramecourt and Agincourt, there was a field. It wasn't a large field. It was only 1,000 feet wide between the trees. For an army of more than 20,000 men, it was cramped. But Henry saw something the French didn't see. Or rather, he saw what would happen to that field after the rain. Because it was raining. Hard. For days. The kind of rain that turns earth into mud. Deep, sticky, treacherous mud. And Henry positioned his army on the north side of the field. He forced the French to position themselves on the south side. He placed his archers on the flanks, protected by the trees, and he waited. The night before, the battle was one of the longest in military history. The English knew they might be living their final hours. They confessed sins. They prayed. They embraced companions. Some wrote letters that would never be delivered. On the other side, the French celebrated. They drank wine. They wagered on who would capture Henry VIII. They discussed how much ransom they would demand for the English nobles. To them, the next day's battle was just a formality. But that night, something was happening. The rain continued, relentless. Each drop that fell sank deeper into the already saturated soil. The field was transforming, slowly, silently, becoming something different. The mud was getting deeper, denser, more dangerous. And Henry V knew it. The dawn of October 25th broke. The feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian. The armies took their positions. On the French side, the sight was impressive. 3 massive lines of cavalry and heavy infantry, armor gleaming under the sun that finally broke through the clouds. Standards of all the great houses of France, the sound of thousands of men and horses moving in formation. It was power. It was confidence. It was inevitability. On the English side, 6,000 men, mostly archers, lean, exhausted, but steady. Henry rode among their ranks. According to the chronicles, he would have spoken words that would become legendary, that each man there, on that day of St. Crispin, would become his brother, that they would be remembered, that this day would be etched in memory forever. But words don't win battles. Terrain wins, positioning wins, and what Henry was about to use as the ultimate weapon. For hours, the two armies stared at each other. Neither side moved. Henry couldn't attack. His men would be massacred in an open advance. The French were in no hurry. Why would they be? They had food, supplies, reinforcements arriving. They could wait as long as they wanted. Eventually, the English would have to act, and that's what happened. Henry ordered his archers to advance. They drove pointed stakes into the ground, a primitive barrier against cavalry. They positioned themselves and fired the first volley of arrows. That was enough. The French could no longer wait. Their honor was being challenged. English archers were shooting at them. They were knights. They were nobles. How could they stand idle while commoners shot arrows? The French cavalry began to move, and then the field showed its true face. The first knights advanced with confidence. Powerful horses, trained for war. Heavy armor, designed to withstand arrows. Lances pointed forward. It was the sight that terrorized armies throughout Europe. The thunder of French cavalry. But with each step, something was terribly wrong. The horses began to slow. Their hooves sank into the mud. It wasn't ordinary mud. It was deep, sucking mud that trapped, that held. Each step demanded double the effort. The horses began to stumble. Some fell. Others refused to continue. And the arrows began to fall. Clouds of arrows, thousands of them. The English archers were the best in the world. They could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. With 5,000 archers, that meant 50,000 arrows per minute filling the sky. Most didn't pierce the armor. The French steel was quality. But they didn't need to pierce. The arrows struck the horses, penetrated necks, eyes, unprotected flanks. The animals began to thrash, terrified, throwing knights to the ground. And when a knight falls from a horse wearing more than 70 pounds of armor, he doesn't get up easily, especially in knee-deep mud. The French charge was disintegrating, and they hadn't even gotten close to the English lines. But the French didn't stop. More waves advanced. Dismounted knights tried to march through the mud. Heavy infantry advanced en masse. They were many. They had to reach the English. They had to break those lines. It was a matter of honor. It was a matter of pride. But the mud didn't care about honor. Didn't care about pride. Every man who advanced sank. The mud reached their knees. For some, up to the waist. Moving was pure exhaustion. Breathing inside the helmet was suffocating. The weight of the armor which should protect was becoming a prison. Men began to fall simply from exhaustion. And when they fell, they couldn't get up. The English saw what was happening, and they advanced. Those sick, starving, exhausted men saw the moment. The archers dropped their bows, grabbed swords, axes, hammers, and attacked. It wasn't a clean battle. It was brutal, visceral. French knights, immobilized by the mud, were attacked from all sides. Blows pierced armor joints, visors were ripped off, knives found throats. It was chaos. It was massacre. The mud that had immobilized the French was now being stained red. Bodies piled up. Men tried to climb mountains of dead comrades to escape the mud, only to slip back and be crushed. The sound was indescribable. Screams muffled by helmets, pleas for mercy. The metallic sound of armor colliding, the wet sound of blades meeting flesh. The French began to retreat. But retreat where? The field was covered in mud and death. Those who tried to flee sank even deeper. Those who tried to stay were surrounded. The French cavalry, the pride of nobility, was being destroyed, not by a superior army, not by revolutionary weapons, but by mud, and by the man who knew how to use it. Henry V had seen what the French ignored. The mud wasn't just an obstacle. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a weapon. And he positioned his army exactly where it needed to be to transform it into the deadliest weapon on the battlefield. The Battle of Agincourt was far from over, but the outcome was already being written. In the mud, in the blood, and in the tactical genius of a king who understood something fundamental. Sometimes, nature fights on your side. You just need to know how to use it. But how exactly did Henry transform mud into victory? How did 6,000 sick men defeat more than 20,000 elite knights? The answer lies in the details we haven't told yet, in the decisions we haven't revealed, in the moments that transformed certain defeat into impossible triumph. And that's where we're going now. The French cavalry began its charge. In minutes, the mud would transform their greatest strength into their deadliest weakness. And then, exactly what Henry was waiting for happened. The French cavalry began to advance. 3,000 mounted knights, each wearing armor weighing over 60 kilograms. Armor made of hand-forged steel plates, helmets decorated with colorful plumes, shields painted with coat of arms of noble families dating back generations. Each piece of metal had cost a fortune. Each knight represented years of training, military tradition, aristocratic pride. They advanced with the confidence of those who had never known defeat. The sound was deafening. 3,000 horses galloping simultaneously produce thunder that you feel in your bones before you hear it with your ears. The ground trembled. The trees at the edges of the field seemed to vibrate with the force of thousands of hooves pounding against the earth. The distance between the two armies rapidly decreased. 100 meters, 80, 60. The English archers remained still, waiting. From the French perspective, that thin line of English soldiers looked pathetic. A few thousand tired, hungry, sick men who had marched for weeks through France without finding adequate supplies. They were trapped against a forest, with no escape route, no reinforcements coming. It was the perfect moment to crush that English force once and for all. But there was a problem the French commanders had completely underestimated: the mud. 24 hours of torrential rain had transformed that battlefield into a swamp. The surface looked solid from afar, but when the first horses hit the center of the field, the scenario changed instantly. The hooves sank. Not just a few centimeters, not just to the ankles. The horses sank to their knees in thick, viscous, suffocating mud. The gallop turned to stumbling. Knights who seconds before were advancing with the speed and momentum of a metal avalanche now struggled just to keep their horses upright. War animals trained to ignore arrows and battle cries began to panic. Some tried to retreat, pushing against the knights coming right behind them. Others fell sideways, knocking down neighboring riders like armored dominoes. And then the armor, that same armor that represented status, protection, invincibility, became a death trap. 130 pounds of metal distributed over a man's entire body is manageable when you're on firm ground. But when you're sinking in mud to your knees, when every movement demands 3 times the normal effort, when your horse has just collapsed and thrown you face first into the mire, 130 pounds of steel become a death sentence. Knights who fell couldn't get up. The weight of the armor pinned them in place. Mud seeped through the gaps in the metal plates, pouring into helmets, making breathing nearly impossible. Some tried to crawl back to their own lines, others simply sank deeper, the weight of the metal accelerating their descent, the mud swallowing entire men as if the battlefield itself were alive and hungry. The French formation disintegrated within minutes. What should have been a devastating charge An impenetrable wall of heavy cavalry crushing a thin line of English infantry had transformed into total chaos. Knights scattered across the entire field. Horses trapped, some lying on their sides breathing heavily, others frantically trying to free themselves from the mud's suction. Men shouting commands that no one could hear. Trumpets blowing, regrouping signals that were impossible to follow. And then the English archers opened fire. 6,000 archers, each capable of shooting 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Do the math. That means between 60,000 and 72,000 arrows in the air every 60 seconds. More than 1,000 arrows per second flying toward targets that couldn't move, couldn't defend themselves, couldn't do absolutely anything except watch death coming from the sky. The English arrows weren't ordinary projectiles. They were wooden shafts nearly 3 feet long, with iron tips forged specifically to pierce armor. When shot from longbows drawn by archers trained since childhood, these arrows had enough force to penetrate steel plates from 100 yards away, and the French were much closer than 100 meters. The first volleys hit like a storm of iron. Arrows pierced helmets, punctured chainmail at the weak points of joints, struck horses in the chest, neck, legs, driving animals that were already panicking into total frenzy. The sound was deafening, not just the whistle of arrows cutting through the air, but the impact of thousands of iron tips striking metal, flesh, bone. The French tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The battlefield was only 300 meters wide, compressed between 2 forests. The mud made any lateral movement practically impossible. And behind the cavalry that had entered first, more waves of French soldiers kept advancing, pushing those in front deeper into the kill zone. It was a concentrated massacre, a funnel of death where the greatest military force in Europe was being slaughtered like animals trapped in a pen. Some French commanders realized the error and tried to order a retreat. But how do you transmit orders in the midst of total chaos? How do you retreat when there are thousands of soldiers pushing forward behind you? Soldiers who cannot see what's happening at the front line, who still believe they're advancing towards glorious victory. You can't. And then the English archers revealed the second part of the trap, the stakes. Before the battle began, whilst the French were still organizing, the English archers had driven thousands of wooden stakes into the ground before them. Stakes sharpened to lethal points, angled upwards, creating a primitive but brutally effective barrier against cavalry. When some French knights, desperate, tried to force a passage through the English lines even with the mud and arrows, they crashed directly into those stakes. Horses were impaled. Knights were thrown forwards, falling directly onto the English infantry waiting for them with axes, warhammers, and daggers designed specifically to find the gaps in armor. The English had another critical advantage that most observers don't immediately notice: light armor. Whilst the French knights wore complete suits of steel plate armor, the English soldiers wore simple mailcoats, or even just gambesons padded jackets that offered minimal protection. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a terrible disadvantage. A fully armored French knight could crush half a dozen lightly armed soldiers without suffering so much as a scratch. But Agincourt was no ordinary circumstance. In the deep mud of that narrow field, mobility was worth more than protection. The English could move. They could advance a few steps to attack a fallen knight, then quickly retreat to the safety of their lines. They could adjust positions, respond to threats, exploit gaps in the French defenses. The French, trapped in their heavy armor, sinking in the mud, could do none of this. The French numerical advantage, that 4-to-1 superiority that should have guaranteed victory, had been completely neutralized. In fact, it had been transformed into a disadvantage. The more French soldiers entered the battlefield, the more congested it became. More immobile targets for the English archers. More bodies falling and creating obstacles for those coming behind. More chaos, more panic, more disintegration of military discipline. And the most brutal thing of all? The mud wasn't hindering the English. It was hindering the French. This was the perfect reversal. The same muddy battlefield that should have been just a minor inconvenience had become England's most powerful ally. Not because the mud was deeper on the French side, it was equally terrible on both sides, but because the English were fighting from a defensive position. They didn't need to advance through the mud. Didn't need to charge whilst carrying 130 pounds of armor whilst crossing a swamp. Didn't need to coordinate cavalry movements on impossible terrain. All they needed to do was stand still and let the archers work. and the archers never stopped shooting. Volley after volley after volley, arrows blocking out the sunlight. The sky literally darkening with the density of projectiles flying in only one direction. Archers grabbed arrows from their quivers, aimed, fired, and immediately grabbed the next arrow in a rhythm that seemed impossible to maintain, but which they sustained for hours. The battlefield transformed into a nightmare scene, bodies piled upon bodies, horses dying in agony in the mud. Noble knights, men who had spent entire lifetimes training for war, who came from military lineages dating back centuries, reduced to helpless victims. Some tried to surrender, shouting that they were nobles, that their families would pay enormous ransoms, that their lives were worth more alive than dead. But in the total confusion of Agincourt, there was no organized system for capturing prisoners. And Henry, worried that French prisoners might regroup and counterattack, gave a controversial order that would be debated by historians for centuries. He ordered the execution of the prisoners. The battle continued. But the outcome was already decided. In less than 3 hours, the majority of the French force had been destroyed. The ground was covered with bodies. The mud, already naturally dark, had become almost black with the blood of thousands of men and horses. The silence that descended over the field when the French finally stopped advancing was deafening in itself. And then, when the fog of battle began to lift, when both sides could finally assess what had happened, the magnitude of the French catastrophe became clear. The numbers are almost impossible to believe. Casualty estimates vary amongst historical sources, but even the most conservative calculations paint a brutal picture. Between 8,000 and 10,000 French soldiers killed, not wounded, killed. Amongst them, the flower of French nobility. Dukes, counts, barons, knights from ancient families whose lineages ended on that muddy day in October. On the English side, between 300 and 500 killed. Some historians place the number even lower. It was a casualty ratio that defied military logic, 20-1, 30-1 by some calculations. The kind of outcome you see when an army massacres unarmed civilians, not when two professional armies face each other on an open field. But Agincourt hadn't been an open field, had it? It had been a perfect trap. Terrain that favored the English. Weather that favored the English. Tactics that favored the English. And perhaps most importantly, French arrogance that had blinded them to all these factors until it was too late. The battle was over. But the true impact of Agincourt was only beginning to reveal itself. Because this wasn't just another medieval military clash. It wasn't just another chapter in the long war between England and France. What had happened on that muddy field on the 25th of October, 1415, had exposed something fundamental about the nature of war that no one was prepared to accept. Heavy cavalry, the backbone of European armies for over 500 years, had been destroyed by archers on foot. Common men, many from humble backgrounds, had massacred the military elite of France. The nobility, with all their expensive armor and years of aristocratic training, had been cut down like animals. The implications were revolutionary, and terrifying for any noble who depended on the traditional feudal system to maintain their power. But not everyone realized this immediately. It would take years, decades even, for the true significance of Agincourt to fully penetrate European military consciousness, because what that battle had proven wasn't just that the English were brilliant tacticians, or that Henry V was an exceptional commander. What Agincourt had proven was that 500 years of military doctrine were obsolete. That heavy armor wasn't invincibility, that cavalry wasn't unbeatable, that the social hierarchy placing noble knights at the top of the military pyramid wasn't a natural law, but merely a convention that could be shattered by any force that understood how to exploit its weaknesses. And this truth, more than the thousands of French bodies rotting in that field, was what truly changed European history forever. Because in less than 3 hours, a muddy field in France had rewritten 500 years of military doctrine. It had proven that the future of warfare didn't belong to armored knights on expensive war horses. It belonged to those who could adapt, to those who could see the battlefield not as it traditionally was, but as it truly existed. Victory was secured. More than 7,000 French soldiers lay dead on the field of Agincourt, while English losses barely reached a few hundred. Henry V, the king who had risked everything on a campaign in France, now stood at the center of one of the most improbable military triumphs in European history. But Agincourt wasn't just a victory. It was a revelation. A brutal demonstration that the rules of medieval warfare, heavy cavalry, massive charges, overwhelming numerical superiority, weren't absolute. Something had changed on that muddy field, and what changed wasn't accidental. The Battle of Agincourt is often described as an English miracle, a victory against all odds where luck smiled on the underdogs. But this narrative ignores the deeper truth. Henry V didn't win by luck. He won because he understood something the French refused to accept. Agincourt was different from all typical medieval battles, not because the English had more courage, but because Henry transformed the battlefield itself into a weapon. Every decision he made, where to fight, how to position his archers, when to wait and when to attack, was calculated to exploit the French army's weaknesses. The mud wasn't a gift from the heavens. The French disorder wasn't an accident. The brutal slaughter that followed wasn't the work of fate. It was strategic engineering in its purest form. The first element of this strategic brilliance was the deliberate choice of battlefield. Henry V didn't simply stumble upon Agincourt and decide to fight there out of desperation. He chose that location because he recognized what it offered: a natural bottleneck. The field was flanked by dense forests on both sides, creating a narrow corridor that severely limited the width of the French battlefront. The French had tens of thousands of soldiers, but at Agincourt, only a fraction of them could advance at any one time. French numerical superiority, which should have been decisive, was neutralized by geography. And Henry knew this. He transformed a battle where he was absurdly outnumbered into a confrontation where numbers mattered less than the space available to maneuver. The forest flanking the field wasn't just scenery. It was an integral part of his strategy. The second element was the positioning of the archers. Henry did not spread his men evenly across the field. He concentrated them in a way that maximized the disadvantage the mud would create for the French knights. The archers were positioned on the flanks, creating crossfire zones that forced any French charge to advance directly through the center of the field, exactly where the mud was deepest. Every step a French knight took sank his legs deeper into the mire, reducing his speed, exhausting his strength, making him an almost static target for the arrows raining down from the flanks. Henry didn't simply take advantage of the mud. He designed his entire battle plan around it, forcing the French to advance exactly where he wanted them to sink. The third element was the tactical innovation of defensive stakes. Before Agincourt, English archers were vulnerable to heavy cavalry charges. A knight galloping toward an archer could slaughter him before he could fire enough arrows to stop him. Henry solved this problem with a brutally effective solution: sharpened wooden stakes, driven into the ground at an angle that turned any cavalry charge into collective suicide. The French horses, already struggling to cross the mud, now faced a physical barrier that impaled them if they continued advancing. The stakes weren't just passive defenses, they were a tactical countermeasure that completely negated the main advantage of French cavalry: speed and impact. Henry V had nullified the most feared weapon of medieval warfare with pieces of wood. But perhaps the most underestimated element of Henry's genius was his patience. He didn't attack. He waited. While the French debated their tactics, organized their lines, and prepared their charges, Henry and his men remained motionless, watching. He knew the French had to attack. He knew French honor culture wouldn't allow them to retreat before a smaller army. So he let them make the mistake. He allowed them to charge through the mud, allowed them to crush against each other in the narrowness of the field, allowed them to transform their own numerical superiority into a catastrophic disadvantage. Henry's patience wasn't hesitation. It was a tactical weapon. He waited until the French fully committed to a strategy doomed to fail, and then let geography and physics do the work. Environmental intelligence was the central principle that separated Henry from the French commanders. The mud wasn't luck. Henry V understood the impact the terrain would have on the French heavy cavalry. He recognized that knights in full plate armor, mounted on equally heavy horses, would sink into the waterlogged ground. He saw that a charge through deep mud wouldn't be a display of strength, but an exercise in exhaustion. The French, on the other hand, didn't adapt their tactics to the terrain. They refused to accept that the battlefield dictated the rules. Their culture of military honor demanded that noble knights lead the charge, even when the mud made those charges useless. French rigidity wasn't just pride. It was a fundamental failure to recognize that environmental conditions had changed the rules of engagement. The contrast between French rigidity and English flexibility was stark. The French prioritized tradition and status. Noble knights, dressed in armor that cost fortunes, insisted on leading the attacks, because that's what honor demanded. Archers were seen as low-status combatants, peasants whose military contribution was secondary. Henry V, on the other hand, embraced tactical flexibility. He equipped his soldiers with lighter armor, allowing greater mobility on difficult terrain. He elevated the longbow, a weapon considered plebeian by French standards, to the center of his military strategy. He was willing to win using peasant weapons because he understood that victory wasn't about honor. It was about results. The central lesson of Agincourt wasn't be brave. It was adapt to conditions. Don't force conditions to adapt to you. Agincourt's legacy transcended the battle itself. It was a paradigmatic watershed in European military history. For the first time so devastatingly, projectile weapons combined with terrain intelligence proved superior to the heavy cavalry charges that had dominated medieval warfare for centuries. Agincourt wasn't an anomaly. It was a harbinger. It signaled that medieval military doctrine, noble knights in impenetrable armor deciding battles through massive charges, was becoming obsolete. The English longbow at Agincourt was just the beginning. Decades later, muskets and firearms would replace bows, but the principle remained the same. Soldiers equipped with long-range weapons, strategically positioned on favorable terrain, could destroy heavy cavalry without ever facing it hand-to-hand. The underdog narrative of Agincourt became legendary precisely because the victory should not have worked. By conventional rules of medieval warfare, the English should have been massacred. They were outnumbered, exhausted, starving, sick, and deep within enemy territory. None of these disadvantages should have been surmountable, and yet they won so completely that the very structure of European warfare began to change. Agincourt proved that human ingenuity, deep tactical understanding, and strategic adaptability could triumph over overwhelming material advantages. That is why the battle resonates to this day. Not because it was an impressive victory, but because it was a victory that defied the very rules of what should have been possible. The universal lessons of Agincourt extend far beyond medieval battlefields. The first lesson is that strategy beats brute force when the environment is properly leveraged. Henry V didn't have more soldiers, better equipment, or greater wealth. He had superior understanding of the terrain and the will to use it. The second lesson is that numerical advantages become irrelevant if the terrain neutralizes them. The French had perhaps 5 times as many soldiers, but at Agincourt, only a fraction of them could fight at once. The third lesson is that true leadership means recognizing what others overlook. Whilst French commanders relied on tradition and numbers, Henry saw mud, bottlenecks, and tactical opportunities. The fourth lesson is that human ingenuity triumphs over impossible odds when applied with precision and discipline. The next time someone tells you the odds are impossible, remember Agincourt. Remember a starving, sick, and cornered English king who turned a muddy field into a death trap. Remember peasant archers who shattered the elite of French cavalry. Remember wooden stakes that nullified centuries of tactical superiority. Sometimes, the answer isn't more force, it's better strategy. Sometimes, winning isn't about having more resources, but about understanding how to use what you have in ways your opponents cannot predict. Agincourt was not a miracle. It was a triumph of tactical intelligence over brute power, of adaptability over rigidity, of strategic vision over blind tradition. And that lesson that the impossible can be achieved when you see what others cannot remains as relevant today as it was on that muddy field over 600 years ago. History remembers Agincourt not just as a battle, but as a moment when human ingenuity rewrote the rules of what was possible. Henry V didn't just win a battle. He proved that deep understanding, tactical patience, and willingness to challenge conventions could transform devastating disadvantages into decisive victories. And that truth, that you can win when all seems lost, if only you understand the battlefield better than your opponent, is why Agincourt continues to inspire. Not because it was easy, but because it was impossible, and Henry V won anyway. Regional adaptations applied. British-English conventions: armor, color, center, favor, honor, recognize, realize, organized, whilst, etc. Idiomatic expressions natural to English speakers. Historical context framed for English-speaking audiences. Metric to imperial conversions, meters to yards, kilograms to pounds, vocabulary refinements for authentic English narrative tone.